My name is Margaret Thompson, and I've been a member of Grace Community Church for 32 years. Let me tell you, the church I walk into today looks nothing like the one I first discovered all those years ago, fresh with grief after losing my husband, James. Back in 1992, Grace Community was a small, humble building on the corner of Maple and Fifth. The paint was peeling, the pews were worn, and on rainy Sundays, we'd place buckets in the sanctuary to catch the drips. But oh, how that little church saved my life. I remember the night I first walked through those doors. It was pouring rain, and I was at my lowest point. James had just passed away from a sudden heart attack at 53 years old. We'd built a successful construction company, together Thompson and Sons, and now I was left with a business empire I never wanted and a heart broken into 1,000 pieces. Pastor William Hayes was the first person I met that night. He was in his 60s then, with kind eyes and silver hair that always seemed a bit disheveled. He didn't ask me about my circumstances or try to fix me with easy answers. He simply sat beside me in that empty sanctuary and said, "God knows your pain, and this church will walk through it with you." Those words changed everything. Over the next months, Pastor Hayes and the congregation became my family. They didn't care that I drove an old sedan or wore the same 3 outfits to church. They didn't know, and I never told them that. James and I had built one of the most successful construction firms in the state. I wanted to be just Margaret, a woman learning to live again, not Margaret Thompson, widow of a wealthy businessman. Pastor Hayes taught me something profound during those difficult months. "Margaret," he told me one afternoon as we pruned the rose bushes outside the church, "the measure of a church isn't in its building or its budget. It's in how it treats the least among us. When we love the forgotten, we're loving Christ Himself." I took those words to heart. I began volunteering with the elderly ministry, helping with the food pantry, visiting shut-ins. The church became my purpose, my healing, my home. And quietly, anonymously, I began to support it financially. I paid off the mortgage. I funded the new roof. I ensured that no family went without Christmas gifts. But I never wanted recognition. I just wanted to give back to the place that had given me life. Pastor Hayes retired 8 years ago. I remember his last sermon like it was yesterday. He stood before us, tears streaming down his weathered face, and said, "Keep this church rooted in love. Buildings may grow, programs may change, but never forget why we're here to love God and love people, especially those the world overlooks." We all cried that day. We promised we would, but promises, I've learned, are easier to make than to keep. 3 years ago, Pastor Rick Chambers arrived. He was 42, charismatic, polished, with a smile that seemed to light up the room. He wore expensive suits, drove a luxury car, and had connections with politicians and business leaders across the state. The search committee was thrilled. "He'll put Grace Community on the map," they said. I had my doubts from the beginning. Something about the way his eyes would scan the congregation during his first sermon as if he were sizing us up, calculating our worth, made me uneasy. But I kept my concerns to myself. Who was I to judge? Maybe I was just an old woman resistant to change. The changes came quickly. Pastor Chambers modernized everything. He brought in a rock band for worship, installed massive video screens, and launched what he called Vision 2025, a plan to transform Grace Community into a megachurch with 3,000 members. "We're thinking too small," he'd say from the pulpit, his voice booming with confidence. "God wants us to prosper. He wants us to build something magnificent for His glory." The longtime members were divided. Some loved the energy and growth. Others missed the intimacy we once had. I watched from my usual seat in the back, row the same spot I'd occupied for 32 years, as our little church transformed into something I barely recognized. Pastor Chambers rarely acknowledged people like me. Oh, he'd give a quick nod or a brief, "Good morning," but his attention was always focused on the wealthy donors. I'd watch him spend 20 minutes chatting with the Hendersons, who owned a chain of car dealerships, while walking past elderly Mrs. Patterson without a word. It hurt, I'll admit, but I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't there for recognition. I was there for God. Still, something gnawed at me. This wasn't the church Pastor Hayes had built. This wasn't the church that had saved me. And as the months passed, I began to wonder if I was watching something precious being destroyed in the name of progress. Little did I know just how right I was or what I would eventually have to do about it. Not everyone at Grace Community had forgotten what the church was supposed to be. There was one person who still seemed to understand Associate Pastor David Morrison. David had joined the staff 2 years before Pastor Chambers arrived. He was in his early 40s, soft-spoken, with a genuine warmth that reminded me of Pastor Hayes. While Pastor Chambers focused on the Sunday services and his networking events with community leaders, David handled the quieter work Bible studies, hospital visits, counseling, and our senior ministry. I first really got to know David during our Wednesday morning senior Bible study. There were usually about 15 of us, mostly widows and widowers, all over 70. We'd meet in the old fellowship hall, which Pastor Chambers had considered renovating into office space before David insisted we needed it. David had a gift for making scripture come alive. He didn't preach at us, he discussed with us. He valued our years of faith and life experience. "You all have walked with God longer than I've been alive," he'd say with a smile. "I'm here to learn as much as to teach." One Wednesday, after the others had left, David approached me. "Margaret, may I ask you something?" "Of course, dear," I said, gathering my Bible and notes. "You've been here a long time. What was Grace Community like before?" I paused, surprised by the question. "Why do you ask?" He sat down across from me, his expression troubled. "Because I feel like we're losing something important. I look around on Sundays, and I see a bigger crowd, more energy, better production. But I also see people like you and the other seniors sitting alone, and I wonder if we're actually becoming less of a church while looking more like one." His honesty touched me. "You're right to be concerned," I said carefully. "This church once felt like a family. Everyone mattered equally. Now," I trailed off, not wanting to speak ill of Pastor Chambers. "Now it feels like a business," David finished quietly. Over the following months, David and I developed a friendship built on shared concerns. He'd visit me at my small home. I'd deliberately chosen a modest house in an older neighborhood, despite my means. And we'd talk about faith, the church, and what it all meant. "Margaret, can I share something with you in confidence?" he asked one afternoon over tea. "Always. I'm worried about Pastor Chambers. The financial decisions he's making, the way he treats different members differently, the lack of transparency, it's not right. I've tried to raise concerns, but I'm just an associate pastor. Nobody listens to me." I squeezed his hand. "Keep being faithful to what you know is right. Your time will come." I had no idea how prophetic those words would be. It was a few weeks later when David made a discovery that would change everything. He was working late one evening, preparing materials for the senior Bible study, when an email popped up on his computer. It was from Pastor Chambers, but it had been sent to David by mistake, clearly meant for the church board instead. The subject line read Donor Management Strategy. David later told me his hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a detailed spreadsheet categorizing every member of Grace Community by their annual giving. We were divided into tiers. Platinum members gave over $50,000 annually. Gold members gave $20,000 to $50,000. Silver members gave $5,000 to $20,000, and everyone else was listed as standard. But that wasn't the worst part. Attached was a strategy document outlining how much time and attention Pastor Chambers should give to each tier. Platinum members received personal monthly calls, invitations to exclusive dinners, and priority pastoral care. Standard members, which included most of the seniors, including me, were marked as low priority, minimal engagement required. David felt sick, but he was also torn. What should he do with this information? Confront Pastor Chambers directly? Go to the board? He knew Pastor Chambers had powerful allies. That's when he remembered something else that had been bothering him. The building expansion project, Pastor Chambers' signature initiative, had gone significantly over budget, yet no financial reports had been shared with the congregation in months. Where was all the money going? Late one night, knowing it was probably wrong but feeling compelled, David accessed the church's financial files on the shared server. What he found made his blood run cold. Pastor Chambers had been writing checks to himself, tens of thousands of dollars labeled as consulting fees and ministry expenses, money that had gone toward a luxury vacation property, a new sports car, a boat, all funded by the generous giving of people who thought they were building God's kingdom. David copied everything to a flash drive. Then he sat in the dark office, praying and weeping. He had evidence of financial abuse and spiritual manipulation, but he also knew Pastor Chambers was connected to powerful people, including several police officers and a county commissioner who attended Grace Community. If I come forward, David thought, I could lose everything. My job, my reputation, maybe even my calling to ministry. But he also thought about Mrs. Patterson, recently widowed and struggling financially, sitting alone each Sunday while Pastor Chambers schmoozed with the wealthy. He thought about the seniors who gave sacrificially from their fixed incomes, not knowing their pastor viewed them as expendable. The next day, David came to my house. He looked like he hadn't slept. Margaret, I need your wisdom. I've discovered something terrible, and I don't know what to do. He told me everything, the tiered system, the financial misconduct, all of it. When he finished, he looked at me with desperate eyes. What should I do? If I'm wrong about this, I'm destroying a man's ministry. But if I'm right and do nothing, I'm enabling something evil. I was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd heard. Part of me wanted to say I was shocked, but truthfully, I wasn't. I'd sensed something was wrong for a long time. David, I finally said, do you remember what Jesus did when he found corruption in the temple? He drove out the money changers. Yes, not because he was angry at people, but because he loved his Father's house too much to let it be defiled. Sometimes love requires confrontation, but the consequences will be what they'll be, I said firmly. You do what's right and trust God with the results. Besides, I added with a slight smile, you're not alone in this. David looked confused. What do you mean? I mean that things are not always what they seem, my dear. And sometimes God prepares people for moments like this long before they arrive. I didn't tell him everything then. I wasn't ready. But I was beginning to realize that my 32 years at Grace Community, my silent support, my anonymous giving, it had all been preparation for what was coming. The question was, did I have the courage to step into the light after so many years in the shadows? The breaking point came during what should have been Grace Community's greatest triumph. Pastor Chambers had spent 2 years planning and fundraising for the new sanctuary initiative, a massive expansion that would triple our worship space, add a coffee shop, bookstore, and state-of-the-art children's center. The architectural renderings were gorgeous. Pastor Chambers displayed them on the video screens every Sunday. His voice filled with passion as he described the magnificent temple we'll build for God's glory. I watched from my back row seat as the congregation grew increasingly divided. Some members were excited about the growth and visibility. Others, particularly the older members and young families, worried about the cost and the changing character of our church. But Pastor Chambers brushed aside all concerns with his characteristic confidence. "We're walking by faith, not by sight," he'd declare. "When we step out in faith, God provides." The construction began in spring. By summer, problems emerged. The soil wasn't suitable for the planned foundation, requiring expensive remediation. Material costs had skyrocketed due to supply chain issues. The contractor discovered code violations that needed correction. Every week brought new unexpected expenses. By fall, the project was 3 months behind schedule and $8 million over budget. The partially completed building sat like a skeleton on our property, a monument to ambition outpacing wisdom. Then came the mail that went out to all church members one Thursday evening. The subject line read, "Urgent Financial Update." My hands trembled as I read Pastor Chambers' message. The construction project had depleted all reserves. The church had taken out loans totaling $15 million. Unless we raised $3 million within 30 days, the bank would foreclose on our property, including the original church building. Grace Community Church, which had stood for 75 years, was about to be lost. The Sunday after that mail might have been the most somber I'd ever experienced at Grace Community. You could feel the tension the moment you walked in. People clustered in worried groups. Some were angry. Others were in tears. Pastor Chambers stood before us that morning, and for the first time he looked rattled. His usual confident smile was strained. His expensive suit seemed somehow inappropriate given the circumstances. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice lacking its usual boom, "we're facing a challenge, but I believe God is testing our faith. The question is, do we believe God can do the impossible?" He went on to cast the crisis as a spiritual test. If we had enough faith, if we gave sacrificially, God would provide. He announced a special Faith Promise campaign, asking every member to pledge at least $500 above their normal giving. I looked around the sanctuary. I saw Mrs. Patterson living on Social Security, pulling out her checkbook with tears in her eyes. I saw the Johnsons, who just had a baby and were struggling with medical bills, whispering to each other with worried expressions. I saw young families who'd been saving for their kids' college funds, now feeling spiritually pressured to empty their accounts. And I saw Pastor Chambers scanning the crowd, his gaze lingering on the wealthiest members, calculating. Something broke inside me in that moment. This wasn't faith, this was manipulation. And these good people, my church family, were being exploited. That afternoon, I called David Morrison. "It's time," I said simply. "Time for what?" "Time for the truth to come out. All of it." We met that evening at my house. I made coffee, and we sat at my kitchen table, the same table where James and I had once planned our business, where I'd grieved his loss, where I'd made the decision to dedicate my life and resources to serving God through Grace Community. "David, before we move forward, there are things you need to know about me," I said. "Things I've kept private for over 30 years. I told him everything. about James and Thompson and Sons Construction, now Thompson Industries, one of the largest commercial construction firms in the region, about the money I'd inherited and invested wisely over the decades, about my anonymous donations that had kept Grace Community afloat more than once, about the fact that I personally owned the land the church sat on, land I'd purchased years ago and donated anonymously, keeping the deed in a trust to protect the church's tax status. David's eyes grew wider with each revelation. Margaret, I had no idea. You live so modestly. You never. I never wanted anyone to know, I said gently. I wanted to be valued for my faith, not my finances. I wanted to experience genuine Christian community, not be treated differently because of money. And Pastor Hayes understood that. He was the only one who knew, and he kept my secret until the day he died. But why tell me now? Because we're going to need proof of everything, the financial misconduct, the tiered membership system, all of it. And because, I paused, choosing my words carefully, I'm going to pay off the church's debt. All of it, but not to save Pastor Chambers, to save the church from him. David leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. Margaret, that's $15 million. I know, and I have it. But here's what we're going to do. I laid out my plan. We'd wait until the deadline was near. Pastor Chambers would be desperate, pressuring the congregation mercilessly. Then, at the last moment, an anonymous donor would pay the entire debt. Pastor Chambers would take credit, claiming it as validation of his leadership. And that's when we'd reveal the truth about the donor, about the financial misconduct, about everything. It's risky, David said. He could spin this against us. Say we're trying to take over the church or something. Perhaps, I acknowledged. But I'm 81 years old, David. I've spent 32 years watching and waiting. I think God kept me here for this moment. I'm not afraid of Rick Chambers. I'm afraid of what will happen to this church and these people if someone doesn't stand up. Over the next 3 weeks, we watched Pastor Chambers become increasingly desperate. He called special meetings. He had personal conversations with wealthy members. He sent multiple emails reminding everyone of the deadline, each one more urgent than the last. I watched it all from my back row seat, my heart breaking for the people around me. Mrs. Patterson sold her late husband's coin collection. The Johnsons cashed out their modest 401k, paying the penalties. Young families skipped meals to have more money to give. And through it all, Pastor Chambers accepted their sacrifices with smiles and promises that God would reward their faith. With 1 week until the deadline, the church had raised $800,000, nowhere near what was needed. The congregation was in despair. Some people had stopped coming altogether, unable to face the impending loss. That's when I made the call to my financial advisor. Transfer $15 million to the Grace Community Church Building Fund, I instructed. Make it anonymous. Have the bank notify Pastor Chambers directly. 3 days before the deadline, Pastor Chambers received the call. David told me later that he'd been in the office and heard Pastor Chambers shout with joy. It's a miracle, he kept saying. God answered our prayers. That Sunday, Pastor Chambers announced the miraculous provision to a sanctuary packed with relieved, grateful people. He stood on stage, arms raised in triumph, taking credit for the answered prayer that had saved the church. I sat in my back row seat, my purse in my lap, feeling the weight of the documents inside. My hands were calm, but my heart was pounding. The moment of truth had arrived. And this time, I wasn't going to stay silent. Pastor Chambers was in the middle of his victory celebration when I stood up. At 81, standing from a pew isn't the quickest maneuver, but I took my time. I'd waited 32 years. A few more seconds wouldn't matter. The sanctuary was packed that Sunday, over 1,000 people, all celebrating the miracle that had saved our church. Pastor Chambers was on stage, describing how his faith had moved God to provide when I rose from my seat in the back row. At first, nobody noticed. Then the people around me began to turn, curious why an elderly woman was standing during the sermon. A ripple of awareness spread through the congregation. Pastor Chambers, sensing the distraction, paused mid-sentence. "Yes, is everything all right?" he called out, shading his eyes to see who had stood. My voice was quiet, but in the silence, it carried. "No, Pastor Chambers, everything is not all right." I picked up my worn leather purse and began walking down the center aisle. My knees aren't what they used to be, and the walk felt impossibly long. But with each step, I felt strength I hadn't known I possessed. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said as I walked, "but there's something this congregation needs to know about the miracle you're celebrating." I could hear whispers rising around me. Pastor Chambers' expression shifted from confusion to annoyance. "Mrs. Thompson, this really isn't the appropriate time?" I reached the front and turned to face the congregation. A lifetime of staying in the background made this moment terrifying. My hands shook, but I thought of Mrs. Patterson's sold coin collection, of the Johnsons' depleted savings, of all the faithful people who'd sacrificed because they believed in something that wasn't true. "The appropriate time," I continued, my voice growing stronger, "was probably before you manipulated this congregation into giving money they couldn't afford. But I'm here now, so we'll call this appropriate enough." The sanctuary had gone completely silent. David Morrison stood up from his seat in the front row, moving to stand beside me. His presence steadied me. "The $15 million that saved this church," I said clearly, "didn't come from God rewarding Pastor Chambers' faith. It came from me." The gasps were audible. Pastor Chambers' face went pale. "That's ridiculous. You're a retired woman on a fixed income who what? Who you ignored for 3 years." I pulled documents from my purse. "These are the bank transfer records showing that I paid your debt in full. All 15 million. I handed the papers to Bill Henderson, the church treasurer, who was sitting in the third row. He looked them over, his expression shifting from skepticism to shock. "They're legitimate," Bill said quietly. "These are official bank documents. Margaret Thompson paid the entire debt last Tuesday." The sanctuary erupted in confused voices. Pastor Chambers stood frozen on stage, clearly trying to process what was happening. "How?" someone shouted from the crowd. "How does she have that kind of money?" "My late husband, James, founded Thompson Industries," I explained. "Many of you drive past our construction sites every day. When he died 32 years ago, I inherited everything. And for 32 years, I've been supporting this church anonymously because I wanted to be part of a genuine Christian community, not treated differently because of money." I turned to face Pastor Chambers directly. Pastor Hayes knew. He was the only one. And he honored my request to keep it private because he understood that wealth shouldn't determine how we're valued in God's house. "This is wonderful news," Pastor Chambers said, recovering his composure and flashing his practiced smile. "Mrs. Thompson, your generosity is astounding." "We're so grateful." "I'm not finished," I said firmly. "David, would you join me, please?" David stepped forward, pulling a flash drive from his pocket. "Over the past year, I've documented serious financial misconduct by Pastor Chambers. This drive contains evidence that he's been categorizing members by their giving levels, providing preferential treatment based on donations, and most seriously using church funds for personal expenses." "That's absurd," Pastor Chambers snapped, his charm evaporating. "These are lies designed to undermine my leadership." "Bill," David said, handing the drive to the treasurer, "the financial records are all there. You'll find checks written to Pastor Chambers, personally, totaling over $300,000 in the past 2 years for things like a vacation home, a luxury vehicle, and boat payments, all labeled as ministry expenses or consulting fees." The congregation was in uproar now. People were shouting questions. Some were defending Pastor Chambers. Others were demanding answers. Bill Henderson plugged the flash drive into his laptop and began scrolling through files, his expression growing darker by the minute. "People, please," Pastor Chambers called out, trying to regain control. "Don't let these two manipulate you. This is clearly a coordinated attack." "Why?" I asked quietly, cutting through the noise. My simple question somehow silenced the room. "Why would we attack you? What would we gain?" I walked slowly to the front row and sat down, suddenly feeling every one of my 81 years. I'm an old woman who's been sitting in the back of this church for over 30 years. I don't want recognition or power. I just wanted to worship in peace. And David? I gestured to the associate pastor. He spent 2 years faithfully serving the people you ignored. The seniors, the struggling families, the ones you marked as low priority in your spreadsheets. Pastor Chambers opened his mouth to respond, but Bill Henderson stood up. "I've seen enough," the treasurer said, his voice shaking with emotion. "These financial records are damning. Pastor Chambers, you owe this church an explanation. Immediately." What happened next, I'll remember for the rest of my life. Pastor Chambers stood on that stage, his face cycling through expressions: anger, fear, calculation. You could almost see him weighing his options. Then, to everyone's shock, his legs seemed to give out. He sank to his knees, not in humility, but in desperation. "Please," he said, and there were tears now. "Please, I'm sorry. I made mistakes. I let ambition cloud my judgment. But this church is my life. Don't take it away from me." It was a performance, and not a very good one. There was no true remorse in his eyes, only fear of losing his position and comfortable lifestyle. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry he'd been caught. I felt no satisfaction watching him kneel there, only sadness. "Pastor Chambers," I said gently, "true repentance isn't about words. It's about changed actions. And I think we all know that you're not sorry for hurting people. You're sorry for losing control." He looked up at me, and for just a moment the mask dropped completely. I saw anger there and contempt. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked off the stage without another word. We heard his car start in the parking lot a few minutes later. He never came back. The sanctuary sat in stunned silence. Finally, someone in the crowd spoke up. It was Mrs. Patterson, dear soul. "What happens now?" she asked. I looked at David, then at the faces of people I'd sat among for 32 years. "Now," I said, "we go back to being what we were always meant to be. A church that values people over programs, faithfulness over fame, and love over everything else." The months following that Sunday were messy. Healing usually is. An emergency board meeting was called that very afternoon. Pastor Chambers officially resigned via email. That evening, his lawyer advised him it was better than being terminated with cause. Bill Henderson conducted a full financial audit that revealed the misconduct was even worse than David had documented. The board filed a formal complaint with the denominational leadership and notified law enforcement about the financial improprieties. But while those necessary procedures unfolded, something more important was happening. Grace Community Church was rediscovering its soul. The board asked David to serve as interim pastor, a role he accepted with characteristic humility. "I'm not Pastor Hayes," he said in his first sermon, "and I'm definitely not trying to be Pastor Chambers. I'm just David, and I'm going to try to help us remember who we are." His first major decision was to call a church-wide town hall meeting. Over 800 people showed up on that Wednesday evening. The sanctuary was packed with members who hadn't attended regularly in years, alongside newcomers who'd only known the Chambers era. David stood at a simple podium he'd had the elaborate stage setup removed and opened the floor for questions, concerns, and suggestions. The meeting lasted 4 hours. People were angry, confused, hurt. Some defended Pastor Chambers, insisting we'd betrayed a man of God. Others shared stories of feeling neglected or manipulated. Young families talked about the financial pressure they'd felt. Seniors described feeling invisible. I listened mostly, but toward the end, someone asked me directly, "Mrs. Thompson, why did you wait so long? If you knew things were wrong, why didn't you speak up sooner?" It was a fair question. I'd asked it of myself many times. "Because I was afraid," I answered honestly, "and because I wanted to believe things would get better on their own." I convinced myself that staying quiet and just supporting the church financially was enough. But I was wrong. Silence in the face of wrongdoing isn't faithfulness, it's cowardice dressed up as patience. An elderly man a few rows back stood up. I recognized him, Harold Chin, a widower who'd been attending Grace Community even longer than me. "Margaret, I've sat near you for almost 20 years. You've been faithfully present every single Sunday, rain or shine. That's not cowardice. That's endurance." And maybe his voice broke slightly. Maybe you were exactly where God needed you to be for exactly this moment. His words broke something open in me, and tears I'd been holding back for weeks finally came. Mrs. Patterson crossed the sanctuary to hug me, and then others joined. In that moment of shared tears and embrace, I felt the church beginning to heal. Over the following months, we implemented real changes. David assembled a task force that included seniors, young families, singles, and longtime members to reimagine what Grace Community should be. They recommended several key changes, all of which the congregation voted to approve. First, complete financial transparency. Every month, detailed financial reports are now posted on the church website and in the fellowship hall. Any expenditure over $1,000 requires board approval with public documentation. Second, elimination of the tiered membership system. We destroyed all those spreadsheets and databases that categorized people by giving. Pastor salaries and church staff compensation are now publicly disclosed. No more secrets about who makes what. Third, a renewed focus on the vulnerable. We doubled the budget for senior ministry, food pantry, and community outreach. We started a financial counseling program for families struggling with debt, many of whom had gone into debt because of the pressure to give during the crisis. Fourth, pastoral care based on need, not donations. David and our two new associate pastors divide their time ensuring everyone receives attention, with priority given to those going through hardship. The transformation wasn't universally popular. About 200 members, mostly those who'd been part of Pastor Chambers' inner circle, left for other churches. Some of them were angry with me, accusing me of orchestrating a hostile takeover. That hurt, I won't lie, but I understood. Change is hard, and some people had genuinely connected with Pastor Chambers' vision of church. I prayed for them and wished them well. But something beautiful happened as those members left, others came back. People who'd drifted away during the Chambers years, who'd felt unwelcome or uncomfortable, began returning. The Peterson family, who'd left 3 years ago when their disabled daughter wasn't adequately accommodated, came back and found a church ready to embrace her fully. The Washingtons, an African American family who'd felt tokenized during Chambers' diversity initiatives, returned and joined the leadership team. Young people started attending too. Millennials and Gen Z folks who'd grown up hearing about hypocritical megachurches and wanted nothing to do with Christianity. They heard about what happened at Grace Community and came curious. Many stayed, drawn by the authenticity and humility they found. 6 months after that pivotal Sunday, we held a vote to call David as our permanent senior pastor. It was nearly unanimous. During his installation service, he asked me to say a few words. I stood before a congregation that had grown to feel truly like family, not because of programs or performance, but because of shared purpose and genuine love. I've been thinking a lot about Pastor Hayes lately, I began, about what he taught me when I first came to this church, broken and grieving. He said that church isn't about buildings or budgets. It's about how we treat the least of these. I looked around at the faces, old and young, wealthy and struggling, people of different backgrounds and life experiences, all together. For too long, I measured my faithfulness by my financial giving. I thought that as long as I supported the church with money, I was doing my part. But I learned something painful sometimes. Faithfulness requires more than writing checks. Sometimes it requires speaking up, even when you're afraid, especially when you're afraid. I paused, gathering my thoughts. This church almost lost its way. We got seduced by size and spectacle. We started measuring success by numbers rather than by transformation. We forgot that Jesus spent most of his time with people the world considered unimportant. But here's what I want you to know: we found our way back. Not because of me or David or any individual. We found our way back because enough people decided that authentic community matters more than impressive productions. Because people like Mrs. Patterson kept showing up faithfully even when they felt invisible. Because David Morrison valued the least of these when he could have been networking with the powerful. I looked directly at David, who was seated behind me. Pastor Morrison, I know you didn't want this role. I know you feel inadequate to the task, but that's exactly why you're the right person. Your humility, your genuine care for every person, regardless of their status or giving, that's what this church needs. Then I turned back to the congregation. And to all of you, we have a second chance. Not many churches get that. Let's not waste it. Let's be a place where the widow matters as much as the wealthy, where children are treasured, where singles aren't overlooked, where the elderly are honored, where the struggling find support, and where everyone, no matter who they are or what they have, knows they're loved by God and by this community. That's the church that saved my life 32 years ago. And by God's grace, that's the church we're going to be again. There wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary, including my own. Now, a year has passed since that tumultuous Sunday when I stood up from my back row seat. I'm 82 now, and I still sit in that same spot every Sunday. Some things don't need to change, but so much else has. The unfinished construction project, that skeleton of Pastor Chambers' ambition, presented us with a decision. Some wanted to complete it as planned. Others suggested we tear it down and return to simplicity. After much prayer and discussion, we chose a middle path that I think would have made Pastor Hayes smile. We're converting the structure into a community center, not a flashy addition to church programming, but a genuine service to our neighborhood. There will be a medical clinic offering free care 2 days a week, a food pantry with dignity where people can shop rather than stand in line for handouts, meeting rooms available to community groups, a commercial kitchen where we'll teach cooking classes and job skills, offices for financial counseling, addiction recovery programs, and mental health services. The cost to retrofit the building is substantial, but I've committed to funding it through a charitable foundation I've established in James's name. This time, though, my giving isn't anonymous. I learned my lesson about the problems that can arise from secrecy, even well-intentioned secrecy. More importantly, the community center won't be just a Grace Community project. We've partnered with other churches, Catholic, Baptist, AME, Methodist, even the synagogue and mosque in our area. It will serve everyone, regardless of faith or background. This is how the church should work, David said at the groundbreaking ceremony. Not competing for members like businesses compete for customers, but collaborating to serve our community like family. My role at Grace Community has changed too. I serve on the board now, though I resisted at first. I'm too old for board meetings, I told David. You're too wise not to be there, he countered. Besides, we need someone who will speak truth, even when it's uncomfortable. You've proven you can do that. He was right. I find I speak up much more now than I did in those decades of sitting quietly in the back. Not because I want attention, but because I understand now that love sometimes requires a voice, not just a presence. Mrs. Patterson and I have become close friends. Every Tuesday, we have lunch together, sometimes at her apartment, sometimes at mine, sometimes at the diner down the street. We talk about our late husbands, our faith journeys, our concerns for the church and the world. She's 10 years younger than me and often jokes that I'm her training wheels for growing old. You show me it's possible to be 82 and still have fire, she told me last week. I thought getting older meant fading away. But you're more alive now than you were when Pastor Chambers was here. She's right, though it took me a while to recognize it. For years, I equated faithfulness with quietness, service with invisibility. I thought making myself small was the same as being humble. But I've learned there's a difference between humility and hiding. True humility isn't about making yourself invisible. It's about seeing yourself clearly, your gifts and limitations, your strengths and weaknesses, and using what you have for something beyond yourself. It's about knowing that you matter not because of what you have or what you can do, but because you're beloved by God. And from that secure place, you can act with both confidence and gentleness. The young people at Grace Community have adopted me as an unofficial grandmother. There's a group of millennials who call themselves the Wisdom Seekers. They meet monthly with seniors from the church to talk about life, faith, and navigating difficult decisions. I'm part of that group along with Harold Chin, Mrs. Patterson, and several others. Last month, a young woman named Elena asked me, Margaret, do you regret waiting so long to speak up? If you could do it over, would you have confronted Pastor Chambers earlier? I thought about that question for a long time. Yes and no, I finally answered. Yes, I regret that people were hurt while I stayed silent. I regret that my fear kept me from acting when action was needed. Those are things I've had to ask God's forgiveness for. But no, I don't regret the journey entirely because it taught me something crucial. We're all capable of self-deception. I convinced myself that staying quiet was about humility when it was really about fear. I told myself that providing money was enough when what was really needed was moral courage. We're all constantly at risk of confusing our comfort with God's will. Elena nodded thoughtfully. So how do we know when to speak up and when to stay quiet? How do we know we're not just imposing our preferences on others? That's the question, isn't it? I smiled. I think we have to keep returning to the basics. What would love do? Not love for our comfort or our preferences or our status, but love for the vulnerable, the overlooked, the hurting. When we see people being harmed, especially in God's name, that's when silence becomes sin. These conversations energize me. I love that young people are asking hard questions about faith and integrity. It gives me hope for the church's future. Speaking of the future, we recently made another significant decision. After much discussion, Grace Community voted to give away half of our annual budget to other ministries and needs beyond our own programs. Half? When the motion was first proposed, some people worried we couldn't sustain it. But David pointed out something profound. We almost lost this church because we focused too much on building our own kingdom. Maybe the way to prevent that in the future is to institutionalize generosity, to build into our very structure the practice of looking beyond ourselves. The vote passed with 85% support. Already, we've funded a struggling inner-city church's after-school program, supported missionaries in 3 countries, paid off medical debt for families in our community, and funded scholarships for students pursuing ministry or social work. And here's the beautiful part, our giving hasn't decreased. In fact, it's increased. When people see their contributions genuinely helping others rather than building monuments to pastoral ego, they give more freely and joyfully. I've had to think carefully about my own giving as well. The foundation I established will eventually donate most of my estate to various causes, the church, certainly, but also medical research, education, poverty relief, and more. But I'm also giving more during my lifetime while I can see the impact. Last month, I paid off the student loans for David Morrison and the 2 associate pastors. They didn't know about it until they received letters from their loan servicers showing zero balance. David came to my house in tears. "Margaret, this is too much," he said. "Nonsense. You've devoted your life to serving others while carrying the burden of that debt. You should be free to minister without that weight. Besides," I added with a smile, "I can't take it with me, and I'd rather see the joy it brings now than have it sit in accounts gathering interest. I've also been thinking about legacy, what I want my life to have meant when I'm gone. For so many years, I thought my legacy would be the financial support I provided to Grace Community. And that's part of it, certainly. But I realize now that my real legacy isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in the lesson I learned and tried to live out in my final years. That faithfulness sometimes requires us to step out of the shadows and into the light, even when it's frightening. That love isn't just a feeling or a private action. Sometimes it's a public stand. That true humility isn't about making ourselves small, but about using our gifts, whatever they are, for the good of others and the glory of God. This past Sunday was particularly meaningful. We celebrated Grace Community's 76th anniversary. David invited me to share some reflections, and as I stood at that podium, no longer in the back row, but at the front where I could look into the faces of people I love, I was overwhelmed with gratitude. When I first walked into this church 32 years ago, I said, I was broken, grieving, and lost. This community put me back together, not with programs or performance, but with simple, steady love, with people who showed up week after week and reminded me that I wasn't alone. We've been through a lot together, joy and pain, growth and loss, triumph and failure. We've made mistakes. We've been hurt. We've had to find our way back to what matters most. But we're still here, still loving God, still loving each other, still trying to be faithful. I paused and looked around at the faces, so many dear faces. I'm 82 years old. I've lived long enough to see that nothing lasts forever except love. Buildings crumble, programs end, people come and go. But love the kind of love that sees the image of God in every person, that values the forgotten, that stands up for truth even when it costs something that love endures. And that's what I see when I look at this church. Not perfection, not a spotless record, but a group of imperfect people committed to loving God and loving others, even when we mess it up, even when it's hard, even when we have to change and grow. That's the church that saved my life. And that's the church I pray will continue to be for whoever walks through our doors in the years to come. There was a long moment of silence when I finished. Then Harold Chen stood and began to clap. Others joined until the whole sanctuary was on its feet, not applauding me. I hope they understood that, but celebrating what we'd become together. After the service, a young couple approached me. They were visitors, they explained, church shopping after recently moving to the area. We've visited a dozen churches, the woman said, and they all felt like performances. We couldn't tell if they wanted us or just our money. But this, she gestured around the sanctuary where people were laughing, hugging, cleaning up together. This feels real. This feels like family. Then welcome home, I said, taking her hand. We're far from perfect, but we're trying to be real. And we'd love to have you. As I drove home that afternoon, yes, I still drive. Though David keeps suggesting I shouldn't, I reflected on the journey that brought me to this point. If you'd told me a year ago that I'd be speaking publicly, serving on the board, being interviewed by denominational leaders about church reform, I'd have said you were crazy. But God has a way of calling us beyond our comfort zones, doesn't He? He takes our fears and transforms them into courage. He takes our hiding and turns it into witness. He takes our silence and makes it into testimony. I'm not the same Margaret Thompson who sat quietly in the back row for 3 decades, but I'm also not someone entirely new. I'm still that widow who found healing in a small church. I'm still that woman who values authentic community over recognition. I'm still that Christian who believes the measure of our faith is how we treat the least among us. I've just learned that sometimes living those values requires stepping into the light. Tomorrow is Wednesday, which means Senior Bible Study with David. We're going through the book of Esther, the story of a woman who had to decide whether to stay safe in silence or risk everything to save her people. Perhaps you were made for such a time as this, her uncle tells her. I understand that now in a way I never did before. We're all made for particular moments. The question is whether we'll have the courage to rise when our moment comes. I'm grateful mine came before it was too late. I'm grateful for Grace Community past, present, and future. I'm grateful for Pastor Hayes, who taught me what church should be. I'm grateful for David Morrison, who had the courage to stand for truth when it would have been easier to look away. I'm grateful for Mrs. Patterson and Harold and all the faithful people who never stopped showing up, even when they felt invisible. And I'm grateful to God, who took a frightened, grieving widow 32 years ago and slowly, patiently transformed her into someone who could stand up and speak truth when it mattered most. My story isn't unique. There are Margaret Thompsons in churches everywhere, people sitting quietly in back rows, convinced they don't matter, believing their role is to support from the shadows. Maybe you're one of them. If you are, I want you to know something: you matter. Your voice matters. Your witness matters. And if you see something wrong, you have both the right and the responsibility to speak up, not with anger or judgment, but with the kind of love that refuses to let harm continue unchallenged. It's scary. I won't lie to you about that. Speaking truth can cost you relationships, comfort, security. It cost me some friendships. It cost me my cherished anonymity. It cost me the quiet, safe faith I'd maintained for decades. But it gave me something far more valuable: integrity, purpose, the knowledge that when my moment came, I didn't stay silent. And it gave me this beautiful community, imperfect but genuine, struggling but faithful, small but mighty in love. That's worth more than any megachurch, any impressive program, any amount of recognition. That's what church is supposed to be. And by God's grace, that's what Grace Community Church is becoming, one faithful day at a time. As I sit here in my living room, looking at the photo on my mantle, James and me on our wedding day, young and full of dreams, I think he'd be proud. Not of the money I've given away, though he'd approve of that, but of the courage I finally found to use my voice. Make your life count, Margaret, he used to tell me. We've been given much. Let's make sure it matters. It took me a long time to understand what that meant, but I think I'm finally getting it. Tomorrow, I'll sit in my back row seat at Grace Community Church. I'll sing the hymns, listen to David's sermon, share coffee and conversation afterward. I'll be present with people I love, serving a God I'm still learning to understand more fully. And if I see something that needs to be said, I'll say it. Because I'm not just the woman in the back row anymore. I'm Margaret Thompson, beloved child of God, member of Grace Community Church, and someone who learned finally at 82 that faithfulness sometimes requires us to stand in the light. May we all find the courage to do the same.